The vampire king sacrificed himself to save his great love, but blood magic came at a terrible price. The king who knelt for a mortal girl. The night the king of Vathorn knelt before a dying peasant girl, every noble in his court thought he had finally lost his mind. They were wrong. He had lost his heart years before that. He just hadn't admitted it until the moment it mattered. His name was Caelan Draven, and for 300 years he had ruled the vampire kingdom of Vathorn with a stillness that frightened even his own generals. He did not laugh. He did not weep. He signed execution orders the way other men signed letters, and he fed only when his body forced him to, as though even his hunger embarrassed him. The court called him the Hollow King behind closed doors because nothing seemed to live inside him anymore. Then a healer named Myra Ashworth wandered into his forest with a basket of herbs and no idea whose land she was trespassing on. She found him in the ruins of an old chapel at the edge of his territory, sitting alone in the dark the way he often did when the weight of centuries pressed too hard on his chest. She didn't scream when she saw his eyes catch the moonlight. She didn't run. She simply asked in the practical tone of someone used to dealing with frightened animals and worse, "Are you hurt?" No one had ever asked him that question, not once in 300 years. He told her to leave. She didn't. Instead, she sat on the broken altar steps a careful distance away and unpacked her basket, because she'd walked 2 hours to gather those herbs, and she wasn't about to waste the trip on a brooding stranger, immortal or not. That was how it began, not with seduction, not with danger, but with a woman too stubborn to be afraid, and a king too lonely to make her leave. She came back the following week, and the week after that. She never asked about his fangs or his age or the rumors that clung to his name like smoke. She asked about the ache in his shoulder from an old wound that never quite healed right, the kind only a healer would notice. She asked if he ever ate anything that wasn't blood, and laughed, actually laughed, a bright, unguarded sound, when he admitted he'd forgotten what bread tasted like. Caelan found himself counting days between her visits. He, who had once measured time in centuries without blinking, began marking it in the small currency of 3 more days until she comes back. His advisors noticed before he did. His oldest friend and steward, a vampire named Ardith who had served 3 kings before him, finally said what the whole court was thinking. "You're falling for immortal. I'm allowed to have a friend." "Kings don't have friends who make them smile like that, Caelan. Kings have weaknesses." He didn't argue because Ardith wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. The trouble was that Vathorn's throne had stood for 3 centuries on a foundation no one liked to speak of aloud. A pact made by the first vampire king with something old and nameless that lived beneath the castle, in a chamber sealed by blood-warded doors. The pact granted the bloodline its immortality, its strength, its dominion over the long winter nights, but it came with a single, ironclad condition. The king of Vathorn could never give his heart fully to a mortal. Should he do so, and should that mortal die while the bond was whole, the pact allowed the king one chance, and only one, to reverse it. A working called the Last Mercy, blood magic old enough to predate the kingdom itself. No king had ever needed to use it. No king had ever loved anyone enough to want to. Caelan didn't know any of this would matter when he let Myra hold his hand for the first time on a frost-bitten evening in late autumn, her fingers warm against his cold skin, her eyes steady on his face like she wasn't afraid of what he was, only curious about who he was underneath it. "You don't have to be the Hollow King with me," she told him. "I don't know how to be anything else." "Then I'll teach you," she said, with the same simple confidence she used when setting a broken bone. "I'm good at fixing things." He let himself fall after that. Slowly, then completely, the way ice gives way to spring, imperceptible, until suddenly the whole frozen lake is water. For 1 full year, the Hollow King was happy. He learned to laugh again quietly in private, where his court couldn't see and gossip about it. He learned the particular sound of her footsteps on the chapel stairs, learned to crave the warmth of her presence the way other vampires craved blood. He told her things he had never told anyone, about his mother, the first queen, who had died screaming in the chamber beneath the castle, paying a price he didn't understand until decades later. About the loneliness of outliving everyone he'd ever cared for. About how he sometimes wondered if the thing beneath the castle had taken more from him than immortality, if it had taken the part of him that was supposed to feel anything at all, until she came along and proved that part was only sleeping. Myra, in turn, told him about her village, her dead parents, her dream of opening a real healing house instead of working out of a basket and a borrowed room. She told him she'd never expected to fall in love with a king, let alone one who didn't breathe. "I didn't expect to fall in love at all," he admitted. "I thought that part of me died with my mother." "Apparently not," she said, smiling against his shoulder. "It just needed the right person to dig it back up." He should have told her about the pact, about the price hidden in loving her. He told himself there would be time later, when the moment was right, when he'd found gentler words for "if you die while I love you, something underground might let me trade everything I am to bring you back, and I don't fully know what that would cost either of us." The moment never came, because 3 days before the first snow of their second winter together, Myra Ashworth collapsed in the village square with blood on her lips, and a fever that no remedy of hers could touch, and the King of Vathorn learned, in the space of a single terrified night, exactly what kind of mistake silence could be. The fever came from nowhere, and that was the first wrong thing about it. Myra had spent her whole life around illness. She knew the shape of every common sickness in the region, the way a lung fever sounded different from a stomach plague, the way pox bloomed differently than measles. This fit nothing. It moved too fast. By the time Kaylan reached her, summoned by a frantic messenger boy who'd run the entire 2 miles from the village without stopping, she was already too weak to sit up, her skin burning hot under his cold hands, her lips stained faintly red from a cough that brought up more blood each hour. He carried her back to the castle himself, ignoring every protest from his own guards about what the court would say about propriety, about the centuries-old rule that no mortal set foot past the outer gates uninvited. He didn't care. He laid her in his own chambers and summoned every physician, healer, and herbalist his kingdom possessed, vampire and human alike. None of them could name what was killing her. "It isn't natural," the eldest physician finally admitted, refusing to meet the king's eyes. "Whatever this is, my lord, it isn't a sickness of the body. Something is unmaking her from the inside." Kaylan sat beside her bed for 3 days without moving, without feeding, watching the only warmth he had left in 300 years burn lower with every hour. Myra drifted in and out of awareness, and in her lucid moments she tried to comfort him, which broke something in his chest more thoroughly than her dying ever could have alone. "Don't look like that," she whispered once, her voice a thread. "I've watched 100 people die. I know what it looks like when it's close. You don't have to pretend for me." "I'm not pretending anything." "Then stop looking so guilty. This isn't your fault." He didn't answer her, because he was beginning to suspect it was. That night, Ardith found him standing alone in the corridor outside the chamber, his hands pressed flat against the stone wall, as though he could hold the castle up through sheer will. "There's a rumour in the lower halls," Ardith said carefully, "about a noblewoman named Voss, about a love spurned, about a woman who knows things about old magic that she shouldn't." Kaylan's head snapped up. He knew the name. Lady Voss was a vampire of ancient blood herself, a woman who had made her interest in the throne, and in him, known for decades before Myra had ever wandered into his forest. She had not taken his rejection well. She had taken it, in fact, with the particular grace of someone who simply waited for a better opportunity to take what she believed should have been hers. He found her in her chambers within the hour, and she did not bother denying it once he had her by the throat. "You can't blame me for wanting what was always meant to be mine," she said, calm even with his hand crushing her windpipe. "She was never going to last, Kaylan. Mortals are an indulgence. I simply hurried along the inevitable." "Undo it." "I can't. The curse isn't mine to lift. It's woven into her blood now, feeding on her life to sustain itself. Only a working stronger than the one I used could stop it." A small, cruel smile. "You know of one, don't you? Your bloodline's dirty little secret, sealed beneath your own throne room." He left her alive only because killing her would not save Myra, and in that moment nothing else mattered enough to spend the time. He went down into the dark beneath the castle for the first time in his life, past the blood-warded doors his mother had died behind, into the sealed chamber no king of Vathorn had entered since the pact was first struck. The thing that lived there did not have a shape so much as a presence. An old and patient hunger pressed into the stone itself, and it greeted him the way it had greeted every desperate king before him, with perfect, terrible understanding. You know the cost, it said in a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere. The last mercy. One chance freely offered, your life traded whole to undo what magic has done to hers. No bargaining, no partial payment, everything or nothing. Then take everything. Are you certain, young king? Your mother asked the same question for a man who did not love her back the way you love this girl. She paid the price and gained only regret. The dead do not always return as they left. He thought of Myra's voice telling him to stop pretending, of her hand, still warm despite everything, finding his in the dark of that fever-lit room. I don't need her to come back perfect, he said. I need her to come back at all. Then kneel, King of Vaethorn, and give me what is mine. He knelt, the same posture the court had mocked him for once before, kneeling for a peasant girl who had never asked him to kneel for anything. This time there was no court to see it. Only the dark and the old thing in it, and the unbearable hope that he was about to trade 300 years of borrowed time for one more chance at a life he'd only just learned how to want. The last thing he felt before the magic took him was relief, what the mercy actually costs. Myra woke at dawn with her fever broken, her lungs clear, her body whole in a way that felt almost obscene after 3 days of dying by inches. For one disoriented moment she thought she'd simply survived, that her own stubborn body had won the fight on its own, the way it had won smaller fights before. Then she turned her head and saw the empty space beside her bed where Kaelan should have been keeping his silent, devoted vigil, and she knew, with the cold certainty of someone who had spent her whole life around death, that something had been traded for her life. She just didn't yet know what. Ardith told her everything because no one else in the castle could meet her eyes long enough to do it. The pact, the last mercy, the price that was supposed to be final and absolute, a king's entire existence surrendered whole to undo a death that magic had caused. Where is he? Myra said. It wasn't a question. That's the part, Ardith said slowly, that no one expected. Kaelan was alive. That was the twist nobody in 300 years of recorded history had seen coming, because no king had ever survived paying the last mercy. The price was supposed to be total, a life given completely, with nothing left over. But Kaelan's love had not been the conditional, performative devotion the old pact was built to measure. It had been something the magic itself didn't have a category for, something that didn't burn out cleanly even when offered up whole. So instead of consuming him entirely the way it had consumed every king before him, the magic had done something crueler and stranger. It took payment in pieces, spread thin across whatever was left of him, and gave back a man who was alive but not, in any sense that mattered, the same. She found him in the old chapel where they'd first met, sitting exactly as he had the very first night, as though 300 years and a desperate bargain had simply folded back on themselves. He looked up when she entered. For one heart-stopping second, there was nothing in his eyes at all. Do you know who I am? She asked very quietly. A long pause, too long. You're the healer, he finally said. You come on Thursdays, you bring herbs. It wasn't I love you. It wasn't even her name. The magic had not taken his life, it had taken his memory of loving her, scattering pieces of who he'd become across the cost of the bargain, the way coins scatter when a purse is cut open. He remembered being king. He remembered 300 years of rule, of duty, of cold competence. He did not remember the year he'd spent learning to laugh again, the conversations in the dark, the moment he decided she was worth more than every condition his bloodline had ever placed on him. The Hollow King was back. Worse than that, he didn't even know there had ever been anything else. Myra refused to accept it. She did what she had always done best. She stayed, and she tended the wound, even when the wound didn't know it was hers to heal. She came back the next Thursday, and the one after that, sitting on the same broken altar steps, telling him the same kinds of small, patient things she told him the first time, not pushing, not begging him to remember, just being present the way she always had been. Ardith warned her it might be cruel, watching her rebuild something that might never come back whole. She didn't care. She'd watched people lose pieces of themselves to fever and grief before, and she'd learned a long time ago that some kinds of healing only happen if someone is stubborn enough to keep showing up. What none of them understood yet, not Myra, not Ardith, not even the king who'd paid the price without reading the fine print of his own bloodline's curse, was that the old thing beneath the castle hadn't simply taken payment and let the matter rest. The pact had been satisfied, technically, but pacts that old were rarely so clean. 300 years of kings had asked it for protection, for strength, for dominion. No one had ever asked it what happened to the pieces of a soul once they were taken as payment. They didn't vanish, they went somewhere. And on the 7th Thursday, as Myra sat beside a king who still looked at her like a stranger, a fragment of fog began curling up from the old chapel floor where no fog had ever gathered before, thin, cold, and faintly, impossibly, shaped like the outline of a woman none of them had ever met. The price comes due. The fog took shape slowly, the way frost spreads across glass, and by the time it had finished, Myra and Kaylan were both staring at a woman who hadn't existed an hour before, pale, hollow-eyed, dressed in the fashion of 3 centuries past. "Hello, son," the figure said, and Kaylan, for the first time since the last mercy, went utterly still with recognition. "You don't remember me either, do you? That's the cruelest part of the bargain. It never tells you the pieces don't just vanish. They go where I went." His mother, the first queen who had paid the last mercy generations ago for a husband who hadn't loved her the way she'd hoped, and who, until this moment, everyone had assumed simply died for nothing. She wasn't whole. She was a fragment, a remnant kept tethered beneath the castle by 3 centuries of unclaimed payment, and her presence now meant only one thing. The old pact had finally been pushed past whatever boundary had held it stable for 300 years. Every king who'd ever paid a piece of himself into that chamber had left something behind, and Kaylan's payment, the strangest, most unfinished payment the magic had ever processed, had cracked the seal holding all those fragments quiet. "It's not done with him," the Queen's fragment said, looking at Myra with something between pity and warning. "A price half paid doesn't stay half paid, it collects the rest. You have until the next new moon before it takes the remainder of what he is, not his memories this time. Him, entirely, the way it was always supposed to." Myra's blood went cold. "There has to be a way to stop it." "There is, but you won't like it." The fragment's voice was already thinning, the fog beginning to unravel back into the dark. The magic only ever wanted what it was promised, total payment, freely given for a love total and whole. Kaylan tried to pay it as a king with duty layered over feeling. That's why it broke instead of completing cleanly. If you want to finish what he started, it has to be paid the way it should have been paid from the beginning, not by a king for a healer. By 2 equals, choosing each other, with nothing held back and nothing owed. Then she was gone, and the chapel was just a chapel again, cold stone and broken windows, and a king who still didn't remember loving the woman standing in front of him. Myra had 3 weeks. She spent them the only way she knew how, not with magic, which she didn't understand, but with the same stubborn patience she'd always used. She told him everything every day, whether he remembered it or not. She told him about the year they'd had, about the bread he liked, the way he used to laugh in private, the night he admitted his mother died for a man who never loved her back. She wasn't trying to force the memories to return. She was trying to give him, fragment by fragment, the chance to choose her again from nothing, to fall in love the same way he had the first time, without the safety net of already knowing the ending. It worked slower than she hoped and faster than she feared. By the 2nd week, he sought her out instead of waiting for Thursdays. By the 3rd, he was laughing again, quietly, the way he used to, in a way that made Ardith stop in the corridor and stare like he'd seen a ghost. On the night of the new moon, the chamber beneath the castle pulled at him anyway, the unpaid remainder of the old bargain dragging him toward the dark whether he was ready or not. Myra followed him down without hesitation, past the blood-warded doors, into the place where his mother had become a fragment, and where he had once knelt to trade his whole existence for one more chance at hers. The thing in the dark spoke to them both this time. The bargain demands a love offered whole by choice with full knowledge of the cost. The king paid blind. Will the healer pay seeing? "It's not my bargain," Myra said, "but I'll finish it. Take what's owed from both of us equally, not him paying for me, us together, or not at all. That is not how the pact was written. Then it's time someone rewrote it." What happened next was something none of the old records, none of the previous kings, none of 300 years of careful pact-keeping had ever accounted for. A payment offered not as a desperate trade by one person for another, but as a mutual equal choice, 2 people choosing the cost together, refusing the old hierarchy of king and subject, payer and payment. The magic, built on centuries of conditional, asymmetrical bargains, had no framework for it. It strained, buckled, and finally, instead of consuming anything at all, it simply broke, the way old, brittle things break when asked to bend in a direction they were never built for. The fragments scattered through 3 centuries of unpaid debts didn't vanish either. They came home. Kaylan's mother, fully formed for the first time in 300 years, stood in that chamber for exactly 1 breath before crumbling gently into peace at last, finally released from a debt that should never have existed in the first place. And Kaylan, whole, present, every memory of the year he'd spent learning to be more than the Hollow King restored in a single overwhelming rush, caught Myra before her knees gave out, both of them laughing and crying in the dark at the bottom of the world they just unmade and remade. "I remember," he said, voice breaking. "I remember all of it. I remember you." "I never stopped reminding you," she said. "I was just waiting for you to catch up." The pact died that night, 300 years of conditional immortality with it, and Vaethorn's bloodline became, for the first time, something closer to ordinary vampires who could love freely, without a debt waiting in the dark to collect on it. Kaylan Draven was no longer the Hollow King. He was simply a man who had nearly lost everything twice, and had learned, both times, exactly what he was willing to pay to keep the one thing that had ever made 300 years of loneliness worth surviving. Myra opened her healing house the following spring, exactly as she'd always planned, though now with a king who insisted on personally guarding the door, and a steward who still occasionally stared at the two of them like he couldn't quite believe how the story had ended. If a love worth everything has ever found you, don't wait for a crisis to say it out loud, tell them today, before the price of silence becomes the one thing you can't afford to pay. If you want to watch the full extended stories, join my Patreon. The link is in the description below. Exclusive and uncensored episodes are available only on Patreon. Check the link in the description.